Most Muslims, I know many, are great people.
Watch this.
People.
You're listening to the Dean Obadala Show, where comedy meets politics and all things in between.
And welcome back to the Obadala Show. We're live Tuesday, May 21st. Right now, very happy to have in studio. Welcome here, Jim Sciutto. You see him on CNN all the time. He has a very unique career because he worked as an American diplomat in China as chief of staff for U.S. ambassador, worked for ABC News, worked for an Asian news you were one time there, and now, of course, CNN's chief national security correspondent. It's got a brand new great book, very compelling. We're going to talk about it, The Shadow War Inside Russia and China's Secret Operations to Defeat America. Jim, welcome to the show, my friend.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Usually when I've been on CNN, you're the one asking questions to me.
I know.
So now I have a tweet here from 1998. What did you mean by... No, I'm kidding. I think there was Twitter in 1998.
Exactly.
So before we talk about the book, I wanted, because we have an opportunity to spend some time here, talk about you a little bit. You have a very unique, I think I had a unique career and stuff, because I went from lawyer to comedian to now media stuff. But you're a guy from New York. Next thing you know, you're studying Chinese history in Yale. You're a half Italian, half Irish guy. How does a half Italian, half Irish guy from New York end up at Yale studying Chinese history?
Well, it's funny. So when I was end of my freshman year, choosing my major was June 4th, 1989. It was the Tiananmen massacre. And so I'm Italian Irish, but I think my family jokes about this. We think we have some ancient Chinese relative because a number of us have been drawn to Asia. But at that time, my mother and my father and two of my sisters were in Beijing when that happened, because one of my sisters was living out there, and my parents and another of my sister came to visit, and they were just touring around China doing typical stuff, and they were in Beijing and found themselves in Beijing in late May 1989. So we have family pictures of them in the midst of the protests there when it was high time in Beijing, happy students, and it was like the world was going to change in China. And they left the day martial law was declared, and then they went on to travel around Asia and end up reading in the papers the horrible events that happened in Tiananmen Square. In fact, recently I found a stack of newspapers my mom had saved from that time. Anyway, I'm choosing my college major, and a lot of my friends are going to study, econ or poli-sci or European history, American. And I was like, you know what? I want to figure out what's going on in China. And then that was like the seed that was planted in my brain, and after college I ended up going over there to study, and my first job as a reporter, I spent years traveling around the region. So it started with that moment.
Do you speak Mandarin?
I do. It's lousy Mandarin. When I'm living in the country and I'm focused on it, because language is about necessity often, and I was pretty good when I left China on this most recent stint, but it's faded a little bit, I'll admit.
So how did you end up working as the chief of staff for U.S. ambassador in Beijing?
So this was one of those life turns that, I'd my whole working life to that point, I'd been a journalist, and I'd been working for ABC for more than 10 years as a foreign correspondent. And I had just come back to Washington, and I was at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2011, which happened to be the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which was the night they launched the Bin Laden raid. Anyway,
oh my God, interesting. Yeah.
But the guy sitting next to me was Obama, had just been chosen to be ambassador to China, Gary Locke, and he was heading out there, and we talked the whole dinner about China and my interest and his interest and whatever. And he invited me out to lunch afterwards, and then that led to a dinner with our wives. And at one of the dinners, my wife actually asked him, she said, "So you're going to China, are you bringing staff with you?" And he's like, "I can only bring one person, and I'm actually looking to bring someone who's not your typical kind of government person." And I'm a guy, so I'm slow. I wasn't like connecting. Connecting. My wife afterwards said, "I think he was kind of asking you subtly if you might be interested." And I looked at my wife and I was like, "There's no way you'd want to move to China right now." We had two young kids. She's like, "Well, I don't know. Maybe it sounds interesting, whatever." And he ended up offering me the job. How
long were you there?
I was there for 2 years. And it felt like one of those things where there's one time in your life where someone's going to offer you a job to go to China to be the chief of staff.
Sure. I'm waiting for that moment in my life.
There you go. It may come.
Maybe.
So we just took a leap and did it.
What was it like living in China with two young kids?
It was fun. I mean, I learned a lot work-wise. The kids we put in a Chinese school, they learn Chinese.
Do they can speak? No.
When they left, they were good, and they're young. I mean, they were young still. They were like 4 and 6, whatever. My older son was fluent, man. I mean, he sounded like a local. Yeah.
Wow.
Which was great. And then my wife works for ABC, and she got the job as the Asia correspondent for ABC. So it was like one of those things where like we were all learning, and it was a life experience.
It's funny you mentioned the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I went this year and I sat next to, because Olivier Knox, who was the president, has a show. He's a Sirius XM. He's our White House correspondent. So we had a lot of tables. So I was sitting next to people from the British embassy who didn't offer me a job. But what I did, I asked them if they could interfere in the election in 2020 to help the Democrat win. I'm like, Russia helped Trump. Could you do something? And they kind of laughed, but I think it was a knowing laugh. I think they're on our side. Not for you. Sure. You're a journalist. I'm on my side here.
The FBI is listening today. They're going to come pick you
At
up.
this point, look, Russia, if you're listening, and that didn't come back to haunt Trump's, like, so England, if you're listening, save us. Take the country back. So you come back, you start becoming a journalist again. Then when did you go to CNN?
So I spent a couple years in China in this job, and I I've been a lifelong journalist, and I realized not too long into it that while I was learning a lot that my nature is to be a reporter. I think you kind of operate independently.
Sure.
Working in government, it's kind of like working for the military. It's very top down. It's a little slow moving. It's bureaucratic, whatever. So I knew I wanted to go back to news, and CNN offered me this job, and I jumped at it.
What do you like so much about being a reporter? Like, clearly you have a passion for that. Like, what is it?
I think, I particularly as a foreign correspondent, which I've spent most of my life, I always tell people it's a paid education to learn about the world and what matters, and to try to discover what's really going on. I mean, I don't want to get. I believe in journalism as a mission.
Sure.
I think it's important. I'm not saying journalists are heroes or we always get it right, but I think that in an open society, journalism matters, and that it's selfishly, it's a great way to learn about the world. And then in terms of making an impact, you do have the opportunity to make a positive impact.
As someone who's really focused on foreign policy, do you feel that there are sometimes network executives underestimate the appetite of Americans to learn about the world? Because New York One used to do the World in a Minute segment on New York One. And I'm like, wow, there's a lot to learn in that minute about the world, as opposed to something sensational and provocative. Of course, you got to do that. I get that. It's cable news. But about longer form segments or even a show on mainstream, and it's not about a CNN thing. I'm just talking about like even ABC or just in general. They are businesses, and I always remind people the bias is towards business. That's really the bias for everything.
No, I hear you. I feel lucky. I work for a global organization like CNN that still has bureaus all around the world. I worked for ABC and watched ABC shrink from a world news operation to just closing down all those bureaus. And no insult to ABC because they still do a lot of great work. But I feel lucky to work for an organization that still has a global news operation. But yes, I do feel that we tend to underestimate people's interest in learning about more stuff, whether it's international or just outside of the kind of bubbles of things that we tend to spend our time on. So, and listen, it's a business, right? We know we all work for businesses, so you gotta maintain eyeballs to pay the bottom line, because we're not the BBC, right? We're not getting tax money to like fund our operations. But I think there's a market, and in many ways, it's kind of a golden age of news because there are so many outlets that are serving so many different interests and even niches. So if one operation isn't doing it, the whole ecosystem of media, I think, is feeding those interests.
And I'm chatting with Jim Sciutto, from CNN, and his new book, and we're going to talk about it in a second, Shadow War, which is a really great book. Let me ask you, as someone who takes journalism so seriously, and I can tell not only you have a passion about it, but you believe, and I'm speaking for you here, you're sitting right across from me, you can correct me, but that you can play a role, you can do something good, you can inform people and make them smarter, more informed. That's better for the electorate, that's better for the world. What is it like from that point of view to hear someone, and this is not partisan, if Trump was a Democrat calling your news outlet and others, but so much CNN, fake news and attacking the media, how does that make you feel?
Listen, I don't think, first of all, personally, I don't care what he says, right? Because I do my job. Right. And the direction I get from my bosses is the same. Tune it out, do your job. And we have enormous support to do that. As an American, I think it's lousy for our country because, first of all, we know the president does that with a purpose. He said it so much. I mean, the Leslie Stahl interview soon after his election, he said, I do it so that if you come up with negative information about me, I can undermine. So it's not it's by design. It's not by accident, but it has an insidious effect because it does seep its way into people's brains and people begin to question stuff. I mean, my attitude, it's interesting. Before I came here, I had drinks with some friends who are in the kind of Trump camp, and I keep in touch with them. They're friends of mine because I think we all have to keep up conversations, and they will attack my news outlet personally sometimes, but we also have substantive conversations. And we were talking about one issue, and then we were talking about Trump's tax returns, and I said that my attitude is, I will always err on the side of transparency. We're an open society. I think people have a right, voters have a right to know this information about the people they elect. And they brought up the Barack Obama sweetheart real estate deal. If you remember this back from, there was a Chicago donor who, anyway,
I
the
remember.
Revco,
They didn't bring up Hillary's emails? That's
thing.
remarkable.
No,
I thought for
I'm
sure
just,
they would have brought up Hillary's emails.
No,
instead.
so they brought that up, and I said, fair point. But the reason we knew about that is because reporters chased down that story in Chicago. And I'm glad they did, because voters needed to know this and make a judgment. So here's the thing, it's better for all of us if you have folks asking hard questions to give, and listen, there are privacy issues, et cetera, but we're better off when we have as much information as possible to make these decisions. And, for me, it's not politics. So we will chase down Democratic wrongdoing or questionable behavior just as much as we will Republicans. Yeah.
And I'm as progressive as they come, but I want the media to be vibrant. I want you to hold Democrats and Republicans and independents, the few out there, accountable. That's the job. I mean, if you don't have a functioning democracy, a functioning press, you don't have a functioning democracy, in my view, because who else?
Right.
The Republicans or Democrats, we're not going to police ourselves the way we're supposed to. It's not going to happen. They're going to cover it up. I've seen Democrats do it in the past, and I'm a Democrat, but this is... So I'm glad that you guys don't care about it. Have you ever felt, when I go on CNN, and I don't go as much as I used to, but when I go on, there were not, years in the past, there was not security inside the newsroom, and that's kind of changed. Do you ever become aware of that? Is there ever concern like I'm here? Because I talked to Sanjay Gupta, and we talked about it, and he was mentioning how he's never been concerned, but his kids would say to him, like, Dad, are you going to be okay at work? Because there's a bomb threat. I mean, really, that kind of stuff. Does that ever come into play? We got
chased off the air in a bomb threat.
I remember.
This is like, my co-anchor, Poppy Harlow, and I were on the air when CNN received a suspicious package in the mail, and we had to go broadcast from the streets. And that, to me, it shows you that the attacks matter because they help inspire this kind of stuff. And it's grossly irresponsible by any measure. And that shouldn't be a partisan position, because when President Trump stands at the front of his rallies and points to the back of the room where you have the press area and says, those guys in the back, fake news, whatever, and people are shouting and cursing and so on. Listen, most of it is meaningless, but all it takes is one guy, right? And we've already seen that one guy a few times. Totally unnecessary and completely irresponsible.
I agree. So let's take a break. We're going to come back, talk to Jim Sciutto. You know him from CNN. He's the Chief National Security Correspondent. We're talking about his book, The Shadow Wars. It's a brand new book, just came out. I saw it on Amazon, I think, #1 seller of new releases I saw today.
It's up there, yeah. If folks are at home and on Amazon and want to go there now, I wouldn't stand in the way.
So let's go. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the shadow war, what's going on. Jim is a foreign policy guy who's lived this stuff, and I found it really eye-opening, compelling, and scary on some level as well. So be right back with Jim Sciutto right here. You're listening to the Dean Obeidallah Show, where we crush Trump's lies every single day.
On Sirius XM Progress 127.
And now, more of the Dean Obeidallah Show on Sirius XM's Progress.
And welcome back, Dean Obeidallah Show. We're live here Tuesday, May 21st, in studio right here, Jim Sciutto. And let's talk about this great new book. It's called The Shadow War, Inside Russia's and China's Secret Operations to Defeat America. And compelling book. First of all, before we go, and I want to break it down, as a former lawyer, I can't help but be logical. So I want to put this, I want to talk about Russia first and China, but when it intersects, that's fine. And we'll have a normal conversation like human beings here. But let me ask you first, what is the Shadow War in a nutshell?
So it is a multi-front, permanent war on the U.S., but that Russia and China share a strategy on. They're not working together, but they share the same strategy. And the idea being, get what they want just below the threshold of a shooting war. They calculate, in effect, how far they can push the envelope without sparking U.S. retaliation. And they've shown remarkable ability to figure out what that threshold is and operate just below it. And multiple fronts. And I think that folks at home are aware of some of the fronts, but maybe not how they connect. But there are a lot of fronts they're not aware of. And for instance, Russia interfered in the election. Fine. China steals state secrets. So they're aware of that. They know that Russia invaded a European country. That's Ukraine. China has created territory in the South China Sea in the midst of seas claimed by multiple countries, including U.S. allies. I believe most people don't know that both Russia and China have tested and deployed weapons in space. Kamikaze satellites, as U.S. Space Command refers to them, that can destroy America's most sensitive space assets. Russia has several of them floating up in the air right now, in space right now. China has that. They've also developed what we call a kidnapper satellite. It's got a grappling arm that can grab a satellite out of orbit. Why does this matter? Because the U.S. depends on satellite assets more than any other country in the world for things like Sirius Radio.
We would depend on it. One day we're off the air, China's got our satellite, folks, in case you're wondering.
So that's radio, entertainment, but also GPS satellites. Now, it doesn't just get you around on your map function.
Interesting.
GPS provides timestamps, which are essential to every trade on the financial markets. You take out GPS satellites, you freeze the financial markets. It has consequences. More importantly, for the military, our military, more advanced but more dependent on this stuff. Smart bombs are no longer smart without satellites. Drones don't operate. U.S. soldiers in the field, they have satellite technology to tell when the bad guys on the other side of the wall, whatever. They could blind U.S. forces by doing this, and that's why they have targeted it. So that's space. In cyber, beyond interfering in elections, both Russia and China have figured out how to penetrate a whole host of critical infrastructure here, whether it be power grids, water treatment systems, etc. Weapons they can deploy either in small form or in the event of a war, again, to paralyze us. So you've got the cyber aspect, you got the space aspect. You have old style land war, but again, just below the threshold of war. And then one more front, and I go into a whole chapter on this, sub warfare. There's a new great game under the waves. Both China and Russia have deployed faster, quieter submarines that are harder for us to track. That allows China and Russia to put nuclear weapons off our coastline without warning. And they've proven this ability. And it's a fight that's still going on. I went on a nuke sub under the Arctic as U.S. sub forces are training to better track Russians. And they're doing that more now because it's getting harder to do. So the Shadow War is multiple fronts, permanent war, but calculating what they can get away with without the U.S. responding in a consequential way.
Now, I get a sense the Cold War didn't end on some level. I mean, that's part of it, it would seem. In your book, and let's start with Russia a little bit here. First of all, economically, you point out in your book that Russia's, like their GDP, their economic output is not that great. I mean, it's equivalent of some of our states. Is that
like
correct?
New Jersey. I mean, by some measures, I would say China's economy is on a par with the U.S. pretty much now. Russia is, and as McCain said, it's a gas station, right? I mean, it has one export, but it has an enormous military.
So, you quote in your book, and I'll ruin his name, the Russian general, Valery Gerasimov, who's put an article, point blank, like, this is what we're going to do. Share, because it's kind of interesting to see the guy writing that in there. What did he share as what Russia's goals were and what they were going to do?
So it's become called the Gerasimov Doctrine, Russia's theory of the shadow war. And as you say, he wrote about it in 2013 in a publication, so you could read his theory, which is played out. And in fact, it's interesting. He laid out, and this was before Russia went into Ukraine with the famous little green men,
Sure.
guys without insignia. We knew they were Russians, but they didn't have the flags.
You have a whole chapter, Little Green Man, all about this.
And he wrote this article months before that, kind of laying out, hey, and we can do it this way. We don't have to say we're doing it. We roll in and, So it's an explicit strategy. And their goal, so Russia and China have somewhat distinct goals. Russia is a zero-sum game player. Their kind of attitude is, if I'm taking the U.S. down, I'm winning. If I can stick my finger in America's eye, that's a win. It's zero-sum. China's a little different. China has a grand ambition of surpassing the U.S. as the world superpower, both economically and militarily. They're playing that long game here. Russia is a disruptor. China wants to overtake us.
So with Russia's attacks on our elections, and we covered in great detail here, and I know that you guys on CNN covered it as well, but there was so much more than a couple of Facebook ads, as Jared Kushner said. There was actually attacks on state and local board of elections. 500,000 Americans, according to the Mueller indictment, had their personal information stolen. Is that just part and parcel of Russia's goal of disrupting America? And is it a win for them by just doing that and us knowing they did it? Because if no one knew they did it, how does it help them? It makes them more powerful for us to know they've done this to us.
Well, it's absolutely a win. First of all, they've worsened divisions here. They're laughing at us. They are. And not just in the political sphere. So Russia jumps into every divisive space you can imagine. I talk about it a little in the book, but they were very active in the Take a Knee NFL protest there. And it's interesting, one way, Michael Hayden, former CIA and NSA director who I interview, one of the many people I interview for the book, he notes how one way we knew the Russians were involved there is because the hashtag is Take a Knee, okay? When you're working in a second language, sometimes you don't get the subtleties there. So the Russian bots were putting out hashtags Take the Knee instead of Take a Knee, which was kind of a hallmark. They didn't quite get the English just right there. But they jump in those spaces to divide. And that's great from them. They're like, a more divided America is a weaker America. Bigger picture, though, they want to undermine the idea that the American democratic system is a better advertisement for the world. So if they make us look foolish and dumb, they could say to their people, that's what you want? You're telling me that system is better than what Putin the Great can offer you? That's part of the motivation too.
So you make a point in your book that administrations before Trump have miscalculated their understanding of the threat of Russia. Where did it start? Where do you see it beginning as our miscalculation? And obviously, what was that miscalculation?
So, and this is something that's common for Russia and China. And again, I'm grateful in the book because I interview a dozen current and former U.S. officials, intelligence, defense officials, Jim Clapper, Ash Carter, Michael Hayden, and sitting commanders, including the current head of Strategic Command, who are self-critical because they were in positions of power for both Democratic and Republican administrations as these mistakes were being made. And they'll say, listen, we all made the mistake of mirroring, looking at Russia, but also China, and saying they want what we want. Welcome them into the international club. Make Russia a partner nation for NATO. Welcome China into the WTO, for instance. And over time, they will change for the positive. They'll become more open. They'll become more rules-based. They'll want to follow the laws, be democratic, etc. And even when all the evidence pointed in the opposite direction, folks still stayed in that mentality. Right. Democrat and Republican, to be clear, there's a lot of blame to go around here. And it's only in recent years where folks, and not everybody, folks have said, you know what, we got that wrong. We got that wrong. And in both, for Russia, it was after the fall of the wall. Here we have this new partner. For China, it was and it's similar timing, right? 80s and the 90s, as China liberalized its economy, the idea was, well, they're going to liberalize across the board.
Sure.
Right? Of course, they'll see the benefit of it. They want what we want. But from their perspective, China, Russia, they're like, no, those are your rules. We're going to play by our own rules. And this works for us.
So, and I think you mentioned it in your book that President Bush, President Obama underestimated Russia, but near the end came to an understanding that
they learned.
These guys are really bad. And I remember, I think it was John McCain, he said, I looked into Putin's eyes and I could see KGB. Like, he was never fooled. But I think a lot of, especially as progressives on my side, want to attach the most aspirational for the benefit. Like, oh, it'd be great if he's a good guy. They've changed now, and we learn they're not. But then you've got, going farther to a side I've never seen, Donald Trump standing in Helsinki next to Putin, defending Putin over our intelligence agencies on the world stage.
He won't go there, and it's damaging, right? It's genuinely damaging. And I'll tell you, don't take it from me. Take it, and you'll see it in the book. If you talk to submarine commanders, okay, no wilting flowers. The guys on the front lines of the submarine warfare. If you talk to the guys at U.S. Air Force Space Command, again, no wilting flowers.
Right.
You talk to folks in the NSA who are fighting the cyber attacks by the thousand every day. They speak in these terms. They say, Russia's the enemy. They are beating us on these several fronts, and we got to stand up, defend, and in certain circumstances fight back. You don't want to get in a war,
Sure.
but you got to, sometimes you got to play a little dirty.
Sure.
Trump won't go there. And why, it's hard to fathom. And clearly he connects it to his election victory, and he doesn't want to, but he has some sort of affinity or respect for the strength of Russian leadership, which, by the way, tortures, imprisons, kills its own people, on a daily basis, as well as other folks. He doesn't see that.
It's beyond an affinity. I have no idea. I'm not going to speculate here, but an affinity might be like, Putin's a good guy. As a person, we get along, but I fundamentally disagree with his policies. To stand on the world stage and say, I'm going to stand with Putin. He denied it. He strongly denied it. I think his exact words along those lines. And slighting our own intelligence agencies was something I had never seen. And I can't even imagine if President Obama had done that, the reaction would have been off the charts. Fox News would have exploded. So, and I don't even want to speculate. I have no idea what's going on, why he does it. I just know it's wrong. And I also know that from what we've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think he's only had one full cabinet meeting to deal with the idea of Russian attacks on upcoming elections. Mm-hmm. And reports were that, like Kirsten Nielsen and others, you can't even bring it up to his face. And this should be, forget the election part, how you won internally. Why don't you discuss in a way that to make us safe for our next election?
Right.
That's much more sinister to me. There's something else afoot, and I don't know what it is. I don't want to even speculate, but something is wrong here.
Well, we don't know why, but the effect is damaging. And because one thing that folks come back to is that to win this, you need leadership from the top. You need a whole of government response to get the resources necessary. As you say, one cabinet level meeting to discuss election security. Are we getting the resources necessary to protect it? And if you talk again to the commanders and the intelligence officials and so on, they say, no, without leadership from the top, you can't effectively fight back.
And interestingly, in your chapter, which we'll get to in a little bit on how to win this, leadership is a big part of that chapter.
It is.
So let's take a break. When we come back, I want to we'll pivot to China. We're going to talk about what's going on there, because I think Russia gets a lot of the press, and except for China in a trade war situation, there's a lot lost in that. So we'll come back with more with Jim Sciutto right after this break. At this point, the question is not who connected to Donald Trump as a criminal. The question is anyone connected to Donald Trump who's not a criminal?
The Dean Obeidallah Show. Sirius XM Progress. to the Dean Obeidallah Show on Sirius XM Progress.
And welcome back to the Obi Dollar Show. We're live right here, Tuesday, May 21st, in studio with Jim Sciutto from CNN, talking his great new book, The Shadow War. So we talk about Russia. Let's talk about the other part of the book, China, which gets some press simply for a trade war situation. But from an economic point of view, is China clearly more of a threat to us than Russia is? But are they truly a threat or just a competitor?
They are a threat because their ambitions are to do more than compete. It's to surpass. And like the Gerasimov doctrine for Russia, China's strategy is explicit. They call it by a different name. It's called winning without fighting. And it's this idea of gaining on the U.S. and eventually taking over while staying below the threshold of war. And they've had enormous success. I mean, certainly economically, technologically,
Sure.
right? And they're ahead of the game, arguably, on things like artificial intelligence. But again, deploying satellites, weapons into space. Their submarines. There was a moment a couple of years ago when a Chinese, it's actually not a nuclear sub, it's a diesel electric, but quieter, popped up in the midst of a U.S. Air Force carrier group without warning and caught them off guard.
Wow.
Which is not what you want to happen if you're
Sure.
a carrier group. So demonstrating their progress there. And it's interesting, whenever I ask folks in intel or defense, okay, you got Russia and China, they will always put Russia and China at the top of their list of threats to the U.S., existential threats,
Sure.
because they have nuclear weapons, but always at the top of the list. Iran and North Korea, threatening, but not on the same scale. Then when I ask them, what's the bigger of those two threats, almost without exception, they'll say China. And the reason being bigger economic power, longer staying power, bigger ambitions, bigger population. That's the one that over time is going to be the real competitor. And it doesn't have to be enemy. It's a competitor. It's an adversary because they don't have the best of intentions for us. Doesn't mean we have to go to war. And the truth is neither side wants war, but you have a lot of conflicting interests which could escalate into an armed conflict.
And, Trump talks about intellectual property theft by China.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about it in your book there that U.S. trade representatives estimate $600 billion a year in theft of intellectual property,
Mm-hmm.
and China being the biggest thief of all. So Trump is right there. Tell us a little bit about what they're stealing and why they're stealing from us.
So they steal everything,
everything.
Right? I mean, they steal private and public sector. So private sector secrets. Some they do via cyber attack, steal the designs for, the iPhone, whatever, a whole host of technology. Some they do by other means. If you're a U.S. company operating in China, they will make deals saying, if you want to operate here, you have to transfer your technology to us, right? It's explicit, right out there. And
Right.
What are they going to do? And then 2 years later, lo and behold, there's a company that looks like yours operating there. I mean, it happens. It's almost comical because it's so transparent. Then you have the national security side, and they are stealing technology with a mission. A chapter in the book is about this one guy, Stephen Su, who over the course of 4 years before he was caught by the FBI, and he's one of the few who's caught, they managed to steal a huge portion of the technology behind three of America's most advanced jets, the F-35, the F-22, and the C-17 transport aircraft. And today, China is flying three jets that look remarkably like the F-35, the F-22, and the C-17 because they did such a damn good job of it. Hundreds of gigabytes of data. And I love this guy, Bob Anderson. He's a former head of counterintel but for the FBI. And he's also a former cop. So he talks like a cop.
Right.
And he says, in effect, they're screwing us, right? He also talks about how vicious China is in its intelligence gathering. He says, there's a great line in there. He says, they will kill you. They will kill your family. Mm-hmm. It's the mob.
Right.
Man, it's the mob.
And that was eye-opening to me because I didn't think of the Chinese. In your book, you mentioned the exact thing. But we have to be spying on them on some level,
of course.
Are we not?
We are.
And what's the difference between our spying? Are we better spies? Are we more good-hearted spies? Are we not stealing things from them?
We don't do it as a matter of policy. And this is Chinese policy, right? We don't do it for economic gain the way they do, right? Listen, and yes, there's lots of spying that goes in both directions, but China does it as part of its business plan. Right? U.S. companies make deals around the world and, partly to, for the sake of their reputations, they don't want to, they want to be a functioning business that's not seen as an arm of the CIA. In fact, you've had, if you remember when some of this NSA spying was revealed, it damaged some U.S. companies' businesses in Europe because the concern was that there were backdoors, that kind of thing. And listen, China pays a price for this too. Huawei, which is a true global competitor in telecommunications and so on, their business is shrinking and may be destroyed because they've been exposed as this. Same for Russia, Kaspersky Labs. I mean, a lot of us used to have it on our computers as antivirus software, so on. But because that's been exposed as having ties to the intelligence, it's business. So there are prices to pay for this when you do it. And so the difference is the U.S. doesn't do that, as a matter of economic policy. And U.S. companies are truly independent of the government. Russian and Chinese companies, by law, got to do this kind of stuff with the intel services.
That's a great point. That's a great distinction, too. So, in the book, there was a chapter where you talked about flying a military P-8, that's the right term, over the South China Sea. I thought it was very interesting. And describe this unique craft for a second first. What is this P-8?
So it's it's the body of a 737, but it's America's most advanced surveillance aircraft. It's called the P-8 Poseidon. And it's actually a sub-hunter too, does both. But so I flew not on a sub-hunting mission, but a spy mission, a surveillance mission over these islands in the South China Sea. And I was the first reporter, my team, my producer and cameraman and I are the first reporters allowed on an operational mission. This was an operational mission. And the U.S. Navy invited us on board because they wanted to send a message. They wanted the footage of CNN flying over the islands and us saying, we know what you're doing here. I mean, they created thousands of football fields of land in the South China Sea, which they've since militarized, missile installations, aircraft, etc., unsinkable aircraft carriers. It was cool, though, because you're there, and as you're coming, China claims this as their territory, so they warned us away, threateningly, as we're coming in 8 times, and increasing anger and firmness. You could see this online because we did a TV story at the time, and it's like, foreign military aircraft leave our airspace now. It was like out of a movie. It was. So,
and I was amazed by the story of what you did. Also, the fact that the U.S. government reached out to CNN, to you, to go do this. How often does that happen? How often does the government say to a media outlet, I want you to help us in our geopolitical goals here?
Well, they don't say we want you to help us.
I know that.
But I'd been pushing to get on this mission for some time. So eventually, and listen, because that would not be okayed unless someone at a high pay grade decided this. We want to expose this to the world, right? So, it's not like someone called me up and said, "Hey, would you like a free ride on a plane?" You're pushing for it over time, and eventually someone makes the decision, to do it.
I thought it was the way you detailed it and the uniqueness of the plane and the whole ride. It was great writing there. So let's talk about near the end of the book. You have how do we win this shadow war, and a few things jumped out at me. And I want to ask about those.
They want something very different. Now that doesn't mean you got to go to war, but it means you have to know them so that you can check them where you can, set red lines and enforce those red lines. And in other areas, maybe negotiate a treaty, say, okay, you got weapons in space. We know that. Let's set some rules. The way we did with the Soviets during the war in terms of nuclear weapons and so on. So know the enemy. And that involves dispensing with this delusion that we've carried for decades, Republican and Democratic administrations. That's know the enemy.
So knowing the enemy, does it also having an awareness that China and Russia don't share not only the same philosophy, but interests? Because I remember talking to Gordon Chang many times about North Korea. And he'd be like, Trump is talking about China helping us. He goes, doesn't he understand that China has their own interests and they don't want North Korea to become South Korea because they have a reason for that? And I'm stunned by that no one in the Trump administration would watch Gordon Chang or any other expert who's telling you that he's not going to help you.
They do it. North Korea is such a great example on that because, this idea, even denuclearization, it's not in North Korea's interest to denuclearize. Right. And U.S. intelligence has told the president it's in their assessments because from their perspective, that's their means of survival. And President Trump on that issue will say, well, they'll make a lot of money if they build condos there. For them, it's like, we're talking about survival, and it's same with China. China's interest is, and a lot of this goes to history, both Russia and China. They're like, we have our own history, our own proud history. Mm-hmm. There was a time when we were on top of the world, and frankly, we believe we belong there, right? So don't deny me and my people's ambition based on some Western developed idea. We know what's right for us. And that's part of knowing the enemy, knowing what their perspective and motivation is.
And knowing their history. I mean, and I think about now with Iran, with Trump saying we're going to wipe Iran off the map and as a country, and not having this understanding that the Iranians have a deep history, a proud history of being a Persian empire. So, and that's embedded, it would be a horrific fight with them. And this is not an Iraq situation. So what else? You talked about leadership, which is really important. And we touched on that a little bit. What about bolstering defenses? What do you do in regards to China? Because Russia, I get a sense if we're going to do with our cyber hacking, but what do you do with China?
Well, it's cybersecurity too, right? I mean, you got to defend critical infrastructure, and part of that critical infrastructure is elections. And by the way, China interferes in our elections too. They do. Maybe not as bluntly, different ways, not releasing John Podesta's emails on the night of the Access Hollywood tape, things like that.
Right.
But they do. So it's security for critical infrastructure, whether it's war nation cyber attack. How has Estonia responded? And I one of the people I poll for these decisions, for these solutions, is the president of Estonia, and they talk about your and my responsibility that we have. A country's only as good as its weakest link in terms of security, and a lot of the way these folks get into the systems is because you or I do dumb stuff. We click on a link. This kind of stuff makes a difference. Each of us has a responsibility. And
you also talk about leadership being important. We're in the heat now of the 2020 race. Of the Democrats, are any of them that you've heard addressing the threats that China and Russia pose? Because so much is about domestic concerns right now, or talking about Trump being a threat, which I get that. But have any articulated that you've heard yet talking about China and Russia in a way that tells you they get what's going on?
Not in the shadow war way. I haven't heard any of them connect the dots here and talk about it in those terms. For pieces, for fronts of the war, yes. I mean, several of the candidates talk about election security, as you would expect. And what's interesting on China's trade misbehavior, whatever you want to call it, that's an area where Republicans and Democrats actually have a lot of overlap on that. And it's one reason why a lot of folks think that this trade war is a multi-year, perhaps permanent kind of thing going forward, because Trump has sort of pushed the envelope on this, but Democrats unlikely to dial it back because a lot of their voters feel the same way, right? So you have some overlap on China as on other questions. I'm going to be doing a town hall coming up with one of the candidates as president to fight this. Yeah, well, maybe it's permanent war, right? Because if you don't, if you're constantly fighting on multiple fronts, then you don't have a final victory, and therefore you don't have a peace agreement at the end of it. You're just constantly in this churn.
It seems I think we're going to be stuck there, and I think you're right. No 2020 Democrat's going to talk about dialing back, stepping up to China or Russia. They want to see as leaders, they want to compare their leadership to Donald Trump. But Jim, thanks for coming in. And again, the book, it's Shadow War, Inside Russia's and China's Secret Operations to Defeat America. It's a great read. It's really well written, very interesting. You make it very interesting and accessible to everyone. Jim, thanks for coming in. And of course, folks, check out Jim every day with Poppy Harlow, who's great too, on, is it 9 to 11 a.m.?
9 to 11 a.m. Eastern.
On CNN.